I always wanted to be a dad. Truly, I did. You know, with me being adopted and not knowing my biological parents, but experiencing, my parents through adoption and all those sorts of things, the idea of being able to look my daughter in the face and see myself was something that I always longed for, because even in the amazing family that I'm in now, that would always be missing. I remember when I first held her in my hands, I was beside myself because I saw myself. You know what I mean? Like it's this wild experience that you long for, that you desire, at least those that want kids. But when it's actually happening in real time, there's no explaining it. It's this wild journey that you come to realize actually started years ago. I think one of the biggest differences I've found from when I desired to be a dad to now being a dad was realizing how much work it is teaching them how to experience the world. My daughter, she's fearless. Like she would, if I allowed her to, she would just go run off on all these kinds of adventures, completely unaware of any dangers that were around her, because she's just adventurous like that. She's a lot like me. She's not afraid to take certain risks. But I didn't realize that once I became a dad that it's not all just these super exciting moments and adventures and stuff like that. There's actually moments of tension because I got to tell her to slow down. I got to tell her to stop, come back. And it's that learning how to cover her without restricting her that really shows me how God is working in all of our lives. Every day, I'm learning more and more how to be a son through my daughter. I'm learning to appreciate life's challenges. I'm learning to experience things in the moment like never before. Because she holds a wonder. It is relentless. And it's that wonder that, if I'm honest, is terrifying. Because I know she is the type to want to experience the world for herself. And who am I to withhold her from that? Because I know what's out there. I know the risks that she's taking, just existing. But it's these things, these moments of tension where the wrestle comes in that really fortify who you are. And if I don't allow her to experience some of the pressure, the relentless nature of life that is constantly trying to pull you from who God has created you to be, if I don't allow her to have that, her foundation will be entirely based on comfort, things she can control. And so my greatest desire for her is not that she runs from pressure, not that she runs from challenge, but that she would have the faith to stand. And it's my job to teach her how to have a faith of her own. Because if she has that, nothing could stop her.
It is great to be with you this morning. As was mentioned, my name is Andy Steiger, And I have the privilege of running an organization called Apologetics Canada. Yes, in which it's not a ministry of apologizing. Apologetics is a Greek word. Apologia, it's found in our Bibles, places like 1 Peter 3:15, where we're instructed to be able to give an answer or a reason for the hope that we have in Jesus. And that word apologia means to give an answer or a reason. And my prayer is that you have an answer or a reason for the hope that you have. More than that it's a good answer. And as we'll be talking about over these next 2 Sundays, that it's the foundation that you've built your lives on. We're going to be talking about the subject of identity. And it's great to be here with you. Matt is a good friend, and Pastor Matt has asked me on a couple different times if I could come and be with you, and it's never worked out. But finally, it's worked out, and so you're getting 2 of me. Well, I'm like making up for past years that I haven't been able to come out here. But he did say to me, he said, Andy, I talked you up last Sunday, so don't let me down. No pressure. Like today we're talking about identity crisis, and like a bit of a crisis, right? Don't let you down. So I'm going to do my best, Matt. But thank you. It is so good to be with you. I love being these different churches throughout the Lower Mainland and just being reminded that we are part of one family. Amen. We are part of one family, and what a privilege that it is to be a part of this family. So over these next 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about this subject of identity, calling this identity crisis. This is part 1, and then next week we'll be looking at part 2. The reason, the video that you watched and this whole topic of identity is a part of something we've been working on as an organization. We got grant funding to film a series called Branded, and it's called the series on identity. And what you watched there was just a little snippet of a video from session 1. And Troy, who you saw in the video, works with me at Apologetics Canada, and that was his daughter, Araya. And we've been working on this series on identity because research indicates right now that identity is the number 1 issue that young people are facing. And I got to tell you, from my time speaking at different churches and different universities across Canada, it absolutely is the case that we are in an identity crisis as a culture, but I would say it's not just our young people. I'd say we're all in a bit of an identity crisis, but particularly our young people. Now, I was just on Vancouver Island a couple weeks ago. I was speaking at a youth worker conference. So this was a conference full of youth pastors and youth workers from across the Lower Mainland, from across the island. And they did a live poll with the audience. I've never seen this before. So all these young people, right, pulling out their phones. And they did this live poll, and they asked, what is the number 1 issue that you are dealing with you young people in your church? So, right, youth pastors, youth workers, and without question, number 1, identity. Identity is an issue that our young people are wrestling with. And as I mentioned, it's an issue that you and I are wrestling with, and that we're going to be tackling over these next 2 Sundays. And for this reason, I want to look at Matthew chapter 5 through 7, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, what we call the Sermon on the Mount. Now, I got to tell you, by the way, I've been to Israel, and I think you and I would call it the Sermon on the Hill, maybe the Sermon on the Knoll. They don't quite have mountains like we do. But one of the things I find interesting is that we even call it a Sermon on the Mount, because when you read it, and what we'll be looking at over these next few Sundays, is it really is an identity sermon. Jesus is preaching on the subject of identity. And so when we look at this topic today, I just want to look at it from 3 different vantage points. The first is I want to look at the question, what's your identity founded on? This is a question that we're going to be coming back to over and over again this morning. What is the foundation that you have built your life on? And then we're going to look at 2 issues that Jesus brings up. First is that you are blessed, and then secondly, you will be blessed. Now, before we jump into the context of Matthew 5 to 7, it's always important to ask, what came before this? What is the context in which we get to this passage, that what's Jesus been up to? Well, if you're in Matthew chapter 5, and if you look over in chapter 4, what you see is that this is an important context in which Jesus has just been in the wilderness, and he has been tempted by Satan, and he has won. He was not seduced by Satan. He was not tricked by Satan. He did not bow his knee to Satan. And this is interesting because when we read the Old Testament, it begins with a garden narrative as well, with Adam and Eve in a garden, and the serpent, Satan, comes and tempts them, and they fail. And you and I find ourselves in a broken world, a world full of evil and sin. And now Matthew here is starting his gospel, and he starts in a very similar way. But instead of a garden, instead of the best of circumstances, it's a wilderness, it's a desert, it's the worst of circumstances. But Jesus doesn't fail. He succeeds. And more than that, and this is something Matthew is trying to really draw you into and ask, who is this Jesus? Who is this guy? Because not only does he succeed against Satan, but we see that he succeeds against demons. He succeeds against the spiritual forces. He succeeds over disease as he heals people. And people are really starting to think about who is this Jesus? I mean, we often refer to him as Jesus Christ. In church, it's important to remember that Christ is not his last name. Christ isn't a name, it's a title. Christ is the Greek word for the Hebrew word Messiah. And Messiah literally means in Hebrew, anointed one or smeared one. It's somebody that has been smeared with oil. And the reason is significant. You see, you and I are used to a monarch being crowned a king. But the Jews smeared their kings with oil. So when we say Jesus Christ, we are quite literally saying King Jesus. King Jesus. Kanye West got it right. If anybody, only young people are going to get that. He had an album called King Jesus. My point in bringing it up, though, is he your king? Is he your king? And more than that, what kind of a king is he? See, this is an issue that the disciples were dealing with, that the Jews were dealing with this time, but it's also an issue that you and I deal with. What kind of a king is he? Because I think a lot of us look at Jesus as, well, is it a king that I have to serve? The beauty of the gospel, the scandal of the gospel, is it's not a king that we're bowing our knee to, but one that picks us up. Yes, we bow our knee, but we're picked up as sons and daughters of the kingdom. That you and I have been adopted into the kingdom, and that this is the scandal of the gospel, and this is the scandal of what Jesus is going to get into, is that you and I have been given an identity in him. That you and I have an identity in the same way that a child has an identity. Now, I don't know if you noticed that with Chris when he was doing this dedication, but he was talking about Jesus, right? Calling the children to come to him and says, unless you come to me as a child, right? I mean, that's how you enter the kingdom of heaven, is like one of these little ones. And the idea there is simply that you're born into it. See, my children were born into my household. They were born into my inheritance. It's not a great inheritance, right? It's not a, this wealth, although my kids would be like, Dad, when you die, can I have this tool? I really want this. And I'm like, guys, okay, first of all, you can have it now. It's a little morbid that you're already fighting over things that you can have when I'm dead. But you and I get this, right? Kids get it. What belongs to you belongs to them. And this is the kind of inheritance you and I have. Jesus talks about being born again, right? That you and I have been born again, not of the flesh, but of the Spirit, and that we have been adopted into the kingdom, and that you and I are heirs of the King. That what belongs to God belongs to you. You will inherit the kingdom. I think this is a little too much for you and I. And so we will always downplay this, won't we? We will always settle for less than the kingdom. And for the Jews, they're like, Jesus, I hear what you're saying, but if we could just have Israel would be cool. You know, if we could just have this land, if we could just not be occupied by Rome, that would be good. And this is a battle that they're dealing with, and it's one that Jesus isn't shying away from, and he understands, he engages it. We're going to read in just a moment from Matthew chapter 5, and when we do, we're going to hear language that is picked up in Isaiah 61. By the way, this is important to note. When you listen to Jesus, when you're reading Jesus, he is constantly picking up Old Testament themes. He's constantly quoting from the Old Testament. And if you want to really appreciate what he's saying, oftentimes you got to go read in the OT. So let's do that before we jump into the scripture this morning. Isaiah 61, I just want to read verses 1 to 3. And this is what we read. The Spirit of the sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. Now you can imagine as the Jews are listening to Jesus, as he picks up on these Old Testament themes, they're like, yeah, that's the kind of Messiah we want. That's the sort of king we want. We want one that's going to come with vengeance, right? We want one that is going to set the captives free from Rome, Jesus. That's what we're looking for. But yet, as we get into this passage shortly, what we see is that what Jesus has to offer is something far greater. That Jesus hasn't come to just defeat Rome, although people were quite ready to settle for that. Jesus has come to defeat sin. He's come to defeat evil. Jesus has come so that you and I can inherit the kingdom. It's far greater. And one of the things that you and I need to appreciate as Jesus begins and starts to get into this identity sermon is actually we need to appreciate that this is an identity sermon. And one of the ways to do that, and this is kind of a unique sermon where Jesus really indicates at the end what he's doing throughout it. And so what I'd like to do before we jump into the beginning is just quickly look at the end. So if you have Matthew open, let's go over to Matthew chapter 7, verse 24 to 27. And we're going to look at this question, the first question that we want to look at this morning. What is your identity founded on? What are you building your life on? Jesus says at the end of the sermon, he says, therefore, those who hear these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. For everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. In other words, Jesus is saying there are two types of people in the world. There are the wise and there are the foolish. Which will you be? You see, the wise build on a solid foundation, but the foolish build on a poor foundation. And you will know the kind of foundation you've built your life on when the storms come. It was interesting when we were filming this series on identity, and we were there with Troy and his daughter, and we were in Tofino when we were filming. And Tofino is often referred to as like the storm capital in British Columbia. And in fact, even before we got there, this crazy storm had come in, like winds of 100 kilometers an hour. The waves were just crashing. And there's like, first of all, we're like, okay, we cannot film in this. And thankfully, the next day was beautiful. But it was a reminder of just how quickly storms can come in and just batter these homes. And as you saw, these homes are established on these rocks, this solid foundation as the waves hit over and over again. Church, our lives are very similar to that. See, Jesus, as he's talking here, he's not talking about your home. He's not talking about where you built your house on. Did you build it in the flats, right? And did the dike break and your home flood? He's not talking about that. He's talking about where have you built your life on? What's the foundation your life is built on? Because storms will come. You will experience the storms of life. And when they come, your foundation will be tested. So make sure that you've built wisely. Build on a solid foundation. I was talking with a friend of mine just on Friday. We were on a hike together. And he was talking about one of the storms that hit in his own life. And I thought this was, really fitting with what I'm talking about today, because he said, Andy, within a 6-month span of time, he said, I went from, I just experienced a number of different storms. And the first storm that he experienced, he said he made a number of wise investments in that had led up to, he bought some different stocks. And he's like, I made $40 million on those stocks. And he said, within a 6-month period of time, I lost all of that money. Those businesses went bankrupt. And then he said, in that period of time, my house caught on fire. My wife got cancer for the 3rd time. And then if that wasn't enough, I got a big bill from the tax man. And in 6 months, he just experienced storm after storm after storm. I'm telling you, when you go through those moments, right, you're going to know what kind of foundation you built on. And what was interesting that he said to me is, you know what his friend's response to him was? They sent him some alcohol. They sent him gifts of wine and other things, because I think for so many in our culture, that's what you do, right? You run from those trials and you try to hide from those storms. But for him, he said, listen, my foundation's built on Jesus. My foundation isn't built on these things. But what about you? What are you building your life on, and can it weather the storms of life? Because the truth is that you and I will experience storms. We will. You cannot hide from it. A professor of mine used to say, Andy, the only thing stopping you from seeing everyone you love and care for die is your own death. Now have a good day, Well, how do you have a good day, right? Life can be brutal, and the truth is, if you haven't experienced a storm, you will. You can bet on it. And sadly, though, life isn't like the weather report. You don't get like an app, right, where you can go, oh, it looks like you're going to have some bad weather, next week. You don't get that with, identity storms, right? Looks like you're going to have a midlife crisis next week, 50% chance of depression tomorrow, right? It's like I got a slight anxiety coming to me later today, right? Like, we don't get that. Storms just hit. You don't see them coming, and when they do, you and I experience either the strength that the foundation we built on or its weakness. So what are you building your life on? Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 to 2, Jesus is preaching to this crowd that has come, and he's challenging them about this foundation, right, that they've built their life on. And we read in Matthew chapter 5, 1 to 2, said, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him and began to teach them. And I think that this is so interesting, by the way, that we see that there is this distinction being made between the crowds and the disciples. Now, I'm not sure if you know what a disciple is, but a disciple is just quite simply a student. In the first century, a disciple followed a rabbi, and a rabbi was a teacher. So those people that follow a rabbi are disciples, they're students. And I got to tell you, this was probably the greatest moment for me as a Christian, is when I realized that I was a student of Jesus. And that only happened when I realized that I wasn't Jesus. I know that might sound kind of funny, but the truth is, I think there's many of us that need to realize that we are not Jesus. We're not. But do you want to be? See, because when I read about Jesus' life and I look at who he is and I look at what he does, I'm like, man, that is not me. I wish it was, but it's not. Jesus, would you teach me? The reality is that you will never come to Jesus as a student to learn until you think you have something to learn. Man, when I read of Jesus there being mocked, beaten, ridiculed, and nailed to a cross, and as he's dying, as he's being crucified, he forgives them, that is not me. It's not you either. But as a student, we could come to him and say, man, would you teach me? Would you teach me to be like you? I had an interesting encounter just recently. I was speaking at a church in Vancouver, and a young man came up to me. I can't remember now if he said he was an atheist or agnostic, but he's been listening to the work of Apologetics Canada for years. He's been coming out to different churches, and he came out to that event. Maybe you're here today, you can come talk to me. But he was just saying to me that really he's a spectator. He has never given his life to the Lord, and he's not convinced that God can actually do something in his life. He's not convinced that God could actually be the foundation for his life. Maybe there's some of you here today that you've been a spectator. You come to church, but you really don't believe. You haven't really entrusted your life to Jesus. If I could just speak to you for a moment, listen, being a Christian is a lot like riding a bike. If you want to ride a bike, you can't read a book on how to ride a bike. If you want to ride a bike, you can't watch somebody else ride a bike. Listen, it's one of those things that if you want to do it, you only learn it by doing it. It's something that you have to make a part of your life. It's something that you have to get on the bike and ride. You're going to fall, but you get back up and you keep riding. And it's only through doing that you can achieve it. Christianity is no different. If you want to follow Jesus, you have to actually walk with him. You have to live and commit to following him and allow him to teach you. I pray that you're willing to allow him to teach you, that he could be king, the foundation, but also that you understand that he loves you and that God has called you sons and daughters of the kingdom, that you and I have an incredible inheritance foundation because of him. This is something we'll pick up on next week, but Jesus uses that language throughout his sermon. You see that this idea of God being Father and you and I being sons and daughters in Matthew 5:9, 48, 6:1, 4, 6, 8, 9, 14, 15, 18, 26, 32. And then in chapter 7, 9, 11, 21, it's in there a lot. Jesus says this a lot. You and I are sons and daughters of the King. But do you live like it? Is it the foundation you built your life on? Now, I just want to look in these 2 points that Jesus brings up as we look at Matthew 5, 3 to 10. And the first thing that Jesus brings up as we look at our identity is Jesus says that you are blessed. You and I are blessed in Jesus. Look at Matthew 5, 3, we read, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. I hope that you're noticing what Jesus is doing here, because there's a lot of Christians that get this wrong. Ours is the kingdom of heaven now. It's not, I think a lot of Christians come at Christianity almost like a job you don't like, right? Where you're just going to work, living for the weekend sort of idea. And I think there's some of us that are just trying to live through this life and we're just waiting for heaven sort of thing. But Jesus is saying, listen, you don't need to die to experience heaven. You can get a taste of heaven and on earth now. You can begin to walk in the kingdom. You can begin to have a relationship with God now. That can be a part of your current life. That you and I have that hope now. And this is the part where Jesus really flips things on its head, because our culture would look at a verse like this in verse 3, and I think our culture would read it like this: "Blessed are the rich in spirit, for theirs is the here and now." But what Jesus is saying is, he's flipping that idea on its head, right? This is a cultural idea that's been with us for a very long time. And Jesus is saying, blessed are the poor in spirit. Why? Because your identity is not based on your condition. It's not based on your life conditions or what's going on in your life. In other words, it's not conditional. True blessing is not about your fortune or misfortune. I think that's obviously how our culture would see things, right? We'd often say, if you're blessed, oh, you're lucky, sort of idea. But Jesus is saying, no, it's not about that. I mean, listen, you could win the lottery today, but be diagnosed with cancer tomorrow. And if you try to build your life on that, it's just going to be a crisis. It's also not about positivity as you seek to count your blessings and forget your troubles. That's not where true blessing comes from. That's not going to lead to a flourishing life. Jesus teaches that true blessing is your present reality for those who trust him. It means then that you can actually flourish even when life sucks. Even when there's a storm and things are not going well and you're frustrated, you can still be blessed. You can still flourish. I have a friend of mine right now who's dying of cancer. He's in the final stages. And one of the things he posts over and over again, I'm blessed. I'm blessed. Why? Well, because he has Jesus. He has a solid foundation that's with him now. Jesus is walking with him now, and he has a future hope. Listen, I think there's a lot of us that sometimes we have what I call the Superman complex. You know, we tend to think that life's storms will never hit us. It's never going to challenge my foundation. It will. For each one of us. So build wisely, Jesus is saying. True blessing is when your identity defines your circumstances, not when your circumstances define your identity. I don't know what's going on in your life right now, but maybe you're in the midst of a storm and you just need to hear that. True blessing is when your identity defines your circumstances, not when your circumstances define your identity. What have you built your life on? What is the foundation that you've built on through the storms of life? See, it's in those storms that you and I realize how we've built. So we want to build wisely, of course. And this is one of those things that's been interesting for me. I've been a pastor for 20 years. And I got to tell you, I guess it's been over 20 years. I've been doing ministry, but I pastored for 20. And one of the things that I would tell you after being a pastor for that many years and what I've seen is that when I first became a Christian, I thought a really impressive miracle by Jesus was when he healed the lame or gave sight to the blind or commanded the sea or a demon or something like that, but that doesn't impress me much anymore. Do you know what really impresses me? Is to see the brokenhearted mended. To see the broken, to see those with a poor foundation made strong, to see those in an identity crisis made whole, to see people reconciled to God and with one another. That is a true miracle. I teach this thing at my church called Questioning Christianity. And we have just different people that are able just to come and ask whatever questions they have. And we were talking this last week, and at my table, I was just bringing up this point of what a real miracle looks like of a heart made new. Because, while I was talking, there was this table that I was just interacting with, and one of the ladies there, her child has just gone into drug and alcohol addiction. And is in the midst of that addiction. And I'm telling you, there's a lot of people, and maybe you can resonate with this. Maybe there's something going on in your life or the life of somebody else, and you're like, can anybody fix this? Is there any way that this could be remedied or made whole? And it's so easy to lose heart and go, nothing can fix that. Nobody could help them. And I was just saying, just reminding them, man, Jesus can. That Jesus can do that. And it was interesting because at the table was one of our table leaders, a friend of mine named Melanie. And I was like, Melanie is a testament to this. She is that great miracle. She was actually adopted. And when she found out who her birth mother was, she'd always had this view of her birth mother as somebody greater than she actually was. And when she realized that her birth mother wasn't this great person, she found herself in drug and alcohol addiction that led her down a very dark path until she hit rock bottom and realized that she had built the foundation of her life on sand. And it was in this moment that she found Jesus and she began to rebuild and begin to build on Jesus. So this very cool moment where Melanie was able to minister to this lady and just say, listen, I'm a demonstration that Jesus can. He can do incredible miracles. He can heal a broken heart, give them a new foundation, and you can build again. Maybe some of you need to hear that. This third point and last point, you will be blessed in Jesus. You'll notice this as Jesus does this Beatitudes. The first one is in the present tense, and all the rest are future tense. This is the hope that we have. Notice what he says starting in verse 4. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. By the way, the meek is a way of talking actually about how you would break a horse, actually. It was about power. The way they described it is power under control. That's what it means to be meek. Blessed are those who have power under control, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Listen, you and I have a present hope, but as Jesus indicates, we live with a future hope. As we build on that foundation, we build on a foundation that provides the whole of our lives with meaning and purpose. Before I became a Christian, I had no desire to have children. Because I would always ask myself, what kind of a world am I bringing a child into? I used to have a friend of mine who would always say, man, I wish that I had never been born because of the kind of world that he found himself into. It was a world that was without hope. But when I found Jesus, I found a world of hope. I found a world of not only can I have hope now, but I have a future hope. But listen, that hope is for those who build wisely, that build their lives on Jesus. The challenge is, though, for many of us, in the midst of the storms of life, we start to question the foundation, or before the storm, we just don't even build wisely, and we buy into culture's idea of what's going to lead to our good. Culture's idea of what's going to lead to my flourishing. And Jesus tells a parable about this in Luke chapter 15 of the prodigal son, a son who leaves his father, right? He's got this incredible inheritance, but he has this idea that it's not enough. And so he heads off into the world, and he finds himself in the midst of everything that the world says is going to lead to his flourishing and to his good, and he tries to build on it until it's absolutely demolished and destroyed, and he hits rock bottom, and he finds his way back to his father. Maybe some of you too just need to hear today, God loves you. He loves you so much that he welcomes you home. That door is always unlocked for you. It's always unlocked for you. And if maybe you're in a moment you need to rebuild, you need to start over, he's inviting you to do that, and he will build with you. I was doing a podcast this last week with a guy by the name of Samuel Perez. If you're interested in our podcast, you can check it out at Apologetics Canada. Samuel's an interesting story. He's a person that bought into culture's idea of what's going to lead to his good. Samuel was dealing with same-sex attraction, and everything that he heard from the world was, you need to go, you do you. And particularly, we're living in a culture right now that wants to define or build for you a foundation built on sexuality. Particularly, this concept of whatever makes you feel good, whatever gives you pleasure, go seek that thing. And so he did. For years, he found himself into a deep, dark hole of trying to find his identity sexually. He talks about his story of going from a gay stripper to Jesus. Said to me, I had hundreds of relationships, hundreds of sexual encounters, and it left me broken, left me in a moment of identity crisis where I was ready to take my own life. He called himself a prodigal son and found his way back to Jesus and began to build anew on that foundation. And one of the things that he said that I thought was really powerful is he said, one of the things that he had to come to terms with is just saying, is answering the question, is Jesus enough for me? And maybe you haven't thought about that. Is Jesus enough for you? Because it's interesting, he is now experiencing the blessing. He's now experiencing the flourishing of relationship with Christ because Christ is enough. And it's not just people like Samuel that struggle with things like this. I struggled with this. When I got married, I had this idea that sex was going to fulfill every desire that I had, and I'm going to be living I'm going to be living the dream sort of idea. And I really had built an identity on that. And that came crumbling down. My first 2 years of marriage were rocky because I found myself in a total identity crisis. I had to rethink, who am I? What have I built my life on? Is Jesus enough for me? Is Jesus enough for you? As we close this sermon, I just want to challenge some false, sandy foundations that we tend to be tempted to build our lives on. And as I say these, maybe some of these will resonate with you. But maybe there's some others that are going on in your own life that you just need to ask yourself the question, is Jesus enough for me? So, for those of you that didn't make the sports team, is Jesus enough for you? For those that don't like the way you look, is Jesus enough for you? For those that don't like how much money you have, is Jesus enough for you? For those chasing likes, subscribers, and views on social media, is Jesus enough for you? For those that have lost hope in politics, is Jesus enough for you? For those that are feeling unfulfilled at work, is Jesus enough for you? For the lonely singles, is Jesus enough for you? For the frustrated spouse, is Jesus enough? For the broken-hearted divorcee, is Jesus enough? For the mourning widow, is Jesus enough? For those that have experienced the loss of a child, is Jesus enough? For those of you caught in addiction, is Jesus enough? For those of you living a lie, is Jesus enough? For those discouraged by the church or by a Christian, is Jesus enough for you? God loves you and wants you to be blessed. He wants you to experience the flourishing of life, but you've got to get your foundation right. You need to build wisely. Blessing will come no matter how difficult things get for those who decide Jesus is enough. Let me just close by saying that one more time. And whatever maybe you're struggling with, just think and ask God just to be speaking to you now as he teaches you. Blessing will come no matter how difficult things get for those who decide Jesus is enough. I'm going to pray. Worship team's going to come back and lead us. But as we close our eyes and as we just meet with the Lord, as we close here, I would just encourage you to allow God to begin to just convict you. And maybe you just need to look at the foundation that you've built your life on, and you need to begin to ask yourself, what have I built on? Have I built a foundation that leads to my current blessing and my future flourishing, or is it a foundation given to me by the world? Is it one in which Jesus is the foundation, or have I made something else the foundation of my life? God, as we come before you this morning and as we just reflect on your sermon, as we reflect on your words, God, I just pray that your Spirit would be convicting each one of us, God, that you would just meet us where we're at in the storms of life that we find ourselves in, and that we would take an honest assessment of what we've built our life on. And God, if there are things that we are building our identity on that are not you, would you convict us? Would you identify those things? God, I pray that we would be able to identify those things before the storms of life hit, before we realize that they can't secure us, that they can't then they don't lead to our flourishing or our blessing. God, help us to build wisely as we seek to root our lives in you, knowing that you are our current blessing and our future hope, and that you are and will always be enough.